Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking, Debbie Buyaki. Today, we'll be taking a flight over nature's view, a 2030 climate journey story as usual, kicking off from Nairobi, landing off at the coast. It's a direct flight today. I hope you enjoy this climate journey story. Seatbelts on and wheels up. So, we're still on this topic of water, today giving more focus on salty water. In the previous episodes, we found out some interesting statistics. Like 1% of water is what is available for human use, basically. But then what do you mean is just 1% of water and the ocean, the seas are all full of water? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. That's because all that water is salty water. It can be directly used like for drinking, irrigation, household use, food production, and so on. So it's too salty to be used directly. It will need some processing and stuff like that. So basically it's just good for swimming, snorkeling, boat rides, all the good stuff we do during vacation. That's what that water is good for initially without being processed. And that's being done. I'd like to put this in. No littering in the oceans when you're going on vacation. Just don't throw plastic there, because actually 2023 in World Environment Day, we were talking about beating plastic. And what I found out is really sad. And all those images of the sharks dying under, ghost gear. Ghost gear is what the fishermen just discard into the ocean when they're done fishing, sometimes forgetfully or just knowingly. So it's really sad to see how the turtles have straws stuck up in their noses and stuff like that, which is really harmful. Some of them eat the plastic thinking it's food. This is just a by the way. Don't throw your plastic into the ocean. And when you're done with the beach, please clean up. We need to respect the ocean and the water bodies, because we're still going to be talking about water, salty water today. Now, to the interlinkages. Here's how climate change and salty water are interconnected, and this is the path that they intersect. So climate change is causing massive shifts in the natural systems, yes. Not being left behind, of course, is seas and oceans and all the other salty water bodies, because we'll see how everything with the effects of climate change kind of also affect water. I don't know if water is alive. I don't think water is alive, but those stuff that exist in it are alive. But even water as just a plain body is also affected by climate change. So here's how the breakdown is going to look like. Water bodies in this sense, maybe seas and oceans. I will stick to both of those because they're the biggest entities that have salty water. So they too are becoming more salty. And as per research, this increase in saltiness has been triggered by, guess the word, human-induced climate change. So at the end of the day, we're still the ones to look in the mirror, and we are the ones who are causing climate change. And climate change is now affecting other more things as a ripple effect of its adversities. One of these being the oceans and seas, which are the biggest sources of salty water. So hold on tight, this is about to get a little bit more complex. Exactly why I say and insist on having your seatbelts on. This is why you'll see the importance of it. So salinity levels have become two parts fronts when it comes to the after effect of climate change. Salinity is affected by two main, fronts when it comes to climate change, and I'm going to break that down for you. The first one, as temperatures increase because of climate change, it affects the density of water. Salty water is more dense than climate change, and for my kids, this dense means heavier. So with having salt inside, the water becomes heavier. So salty water is more dense than fresh water, and because of climate change, it's becoming more salty, meaning it's becoming more denser or more heavier, right? So when water from the sea becomes heavier or denser, it makes circulation from the tropics to the poles a bit more difficult. We have two tropics, the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, one in the north, one in the south. This is a whole geography lesson, and grab your maps if you want to understand what I'm talking about. Tropics are important lines of latitude, because they determine what zone of the earth has cold or warmer, tropical or non-tropical conditions. Our big word, of course, being climate here. So the tropics determine what per season or per month of the season in regards to where you're located, either in the Tropic of Cancer or at the Tropic of Capricorn, what season you're going to be experiencing. So this is more turning into a geography lesson, but in short, these latitude lines determine how the weather is going to be. Is it summer, winter, autumn, spring, depending on what side you are. And back to where I was starting from. So when water is heavier or denser in the ocean, it makes the ocean currents more difficult to move. Like they become so heavy to move along the tropics. And as we know, ocean currents control the heat or the world temperature. That's how they are carried is how the world temperatures will be determined. So when we're having the water not moving because they're too heavy, we ultimately have some areas of the planet not being regulated by the ocean currents. So if in the Tropic of Cancer, the waves are too heavy to move to the Tropic of Capricorn, it will mean that people and the communities in the Tropic of Capricorn will not as much have the said weather patterns that they should have as per that month of the year, because the water currents have regulated the temperature. So if it's summer, it's going to be a longer summer. If it's winter, it's going to be a longer winter because the ocean currents carrying the temperature to stabilize whatever season of the year you're facing will not have moved that much to its effects. And ultimately, this will affect the world's general climate and climatic seasons. So I hope you understand the first linkage between salty water and climate change. I think I have given a more or less example. If the people in south of Tropic of Capricorn are having a scorchy summer, but the oceans in the north cannot wave themselves up to the south because of the denseness due to increase in salt, that being caused by the climate-induced factors of, industrial waste and stuff like that are increasing saltiness into the water bodies. So the temperatures in the south become uncontrollably high. And we know the ripple effects of high temperatures also come playing forward into drought, failed agricultural yields, food scarcity, strained economies, and so on and so on. And this you can also take a look back at season 1 to have the in-depth analysis of what climate change does to the ripple effects of certain industries and ways of life. The second linkage is basically what climate change does to the surface salinity. Salinity is the saltiness. What climate change does to this surface saltiness and the overall effect it has on the water cycle. So just hang on tight. What is the water cycle? This is when water vapor evaporated from the surface of bodies like oceans, lakes, seas, and stuff like that rises to the sky, is collected in drifting clouds, and eventually released back to the earth as rain or snow. So basically the water cycle is how rain is formed. I hope you guys took a bit of geography maybe in primary school, but the image of water vapor rising from a water body and then it gets to the clouds and it comes back on the other side as rain. So that's the water cycle. It's also called the hydrologic cycle. That doesn't matter. Water cycle. At the end, if climate change is going to affect this, it's going to do it and affect the water cycle in terms of the rain capacity being produced and the rain amount being produced. Honestly, I am so proud of my geography skills at this point. But anyways, here's a phenomenon that's a bit interesting to you, or it should take an interest to you. It'd be great if you could dig deeper if you want to learn more about the water cycle, because I don't want to get into the intricacies of it, but the activities are formed by salty water. The saltiness of water makes it more dense. That's something we agreed during example 1. It becomes more heavier. So when it becomes heavier, when the sun hits the surface of the water, it becomes more heavier to get water vapor out of it. So it's not easily heated to water vapor because it's a bit heavier to do so. And that means less water vapor in the drifting clouds. And that means less rain on the other side of is it the water body? Does it rain like on the water body as well? I can't remember that diagram. But point is, heavier water, less water vapor, less rain, and less fresh water, and water for usage, which we've talked about in episode 1. So that's the second example and linkage of the effects of climate change on salty water. I hope you understood it. So let me bring in another cycle of relatedness in all this. There's a common phrase in climate change, and it says, it's like a phrase: climate change causes the rise in sea water or water body levels. And that's something we've been seeing, especially in island countries in Oceania. And I would give out a big shout out to Vanuatu for really campaigning against some climate change adversities and advocating for accountability. This is still on my side with Stop Ecocide. But climate change for sure is causing a rise in sea levels and water levels across the world, and the biggest affected countries of these are island countries. And there's a whole bucket of statistics on how far the water could rise comparing now and a few more years to come. There's been lots of projections on how some countries could potentially be submerged. So climate change causes that. Rising sea levels results in what I'm calling intrusion of salty water in soils for agricultural fields. And the ripple effect goes into decreased food production and therefore climate change, migration, and food insecurity, and general political instability and no peace. This is something we've talked about as well in season 1 on how climate change causes all of this. So when the sea water levels or ocean water levels are rising too much, that they're getting into the fields, and now people have to migrate, or people now can no longer farm in those fields because the water is too salty or the soils are too salty, then they move to somewhere else, and then it's now a scramble and petition for the scarce resources again. That's a whole fiesta and siesta on climate change and how salty water is a whole menace when it comes to the effects of climate change. So we can't really talk about climate change without missing salty water. And this is something also interesting I found out during this research. And it's kind of mind-blowing to see also how things that we thought can't as much be impacted by climate change in certain ways. For sure, I didn't know that the rise of sea levels, maybe also because I've lived in Nairobi, which is more of the city side, and haven't quite experienced like the rise in ocean levels in the coast as an issue. Maybe they could explain to us more how that is affecting their agricultural produces and the lands and the fields that can no longer be used. But this is the thing with climate change. Just because it's not affecting you, it doesn't mean it isn't affecting the people there, or it is less of a burden to them because you quite don't understand it. And this is basically as well the impact and the essence of this podcast, to inform the masses of what's happening and hopefully be inspired as well from where you are to take action, climate smart actions, or just speak about climate to people and then, get it on policy tables that will. And this is season 1, I'm repeating, but salty water and climate change have great interlinkages, maybe much more to some extent as compared to fresh water, because salty water is something that will need a lot of work to desalinize. And I know many countries in the Middle East are really great at this, but in other countries, it's not so much of an option because of the money that goes into it. So climate change migration is usually the first option. Anyway, how do water bodies become more saline, especially through these times that we've been seeing? This year's maybe from 2015 to now, which is half the set time for the SDGs, there's actually been stats showing that water bodies have become even more saline. It's just a question as well on the SDGs. Are we really moving in the right direction if everything is going worse? Yesterday I also found out that the 1.5 degrees threshold is going to be surpassed within less than 5 years. So we're getting worse instead of better. But at the end of the day, I have options and suggestions for action for everyone. And I hope we can make it to 2030 and beyond in regard to this climate change podcast. So water becomes more saline. Water bodies become more salty with, of course, human-induced activities. These are such as pouring saline drainage from mines into rivers. During winters, this is something maybe I can't talk about much in my country. This could be talked about maybe in the East and the West, and maybe in Europe. During winter, the clamping of roads with blocks of salt, or as well as just removing the snow with salt all the time. Where does this water go, and where do they dump all this? What happens to the land where they dump all that? Does it, when it's getting warmer, when it starts flowing now, what happens to the rivers and the fish and the biodiversity found there? now that the water is becoming more salty going forward. And if that water is becoming salty, let's say it's just like a local community with the lake. If that lake is becoming more salty, what happens to your rainy season in the next few months? In regards to what we've talked about throughout the whole podcast with having the water vapor less in the atmosphere because it's too heavy to be heated by the sun. So these are some of the human-induced activities that cause increase in salinity of water bodies. And this is something I want to talk about addressing policymakers or also individuals. Are there better ways that we can look into all these human-induced activities? For example, pouring saline damage and drainage into rivers and water bodies. I think this is something in my country as well. They wait for the rainy season. I was having a discussion with some lady who's great and has done lots of research in water this weekend. And she said they actually wait for the rainy season to release all this effluents from the chemical industries and toxins into the rivers because, they'll just flow with the rain and will land wherever it will land. At the end of the day, it ends up in Nairobi River, which is kind of facing a lot of issues with dirt and toxins that go all the way into informal settlements where it affects the kids who play around it. It's a whole ripple effect when you start looking at human activity. And this is something we truly need to look into the mirror when it comes to climate change in regards to solutions. We are the instigators, more or less, the biggest instigators of climate change, yet we are still the ones who suffer the most from it. So what action needs to be taken? And something I think, by the way, this is just a detour. I think I also suggested in a different forum that we need to have an SDG that's called human behavior. We need to think really about what our actions are doing and how we are, in the end of the day, crying about the effects of our own actions. So change in behavior, change in human behavior should be something that should be considered as an SDG. Whispers Antonio Guterres. Anyway, in conclusion, human-induced climate change and salinity in water bodies causes more effects on climate change, and not only to human beings as well, but to the species that exist in these water bodies and the biodiversity around these water bodies. So this seemingly is turning into a cycle. We increase the salinity, the rains fail, the oceans fail to regulate temperature. That's the first example. We suffer from the effects of this climate change with less rain and less food and less and increased temperatures. So let's really take time to look into the mirror when we talk about the horrible effects of climate change and try to examine who really started it. In Swahili, we say something, you have a question that asks, nani kajipalia makaa kwenye miguu? So that's basically who is placing the hot coal on their own laps. Is it climate change or is it us who are really doing it? So I hope you've understood the linkages between climate change and salty water. The first being an example on the increase in temperature and how it is affected by how the ocean currents do not get in time to that zone or entirely don't get there at all. This is actually June in Nairobi when I'm recording this, and it's super sunny. And for the past few years, June, July is what we kind of call our winter months. It's super cold. So what happened to the ocean currents that are supposed to reach here with the with the cold? Because it's really hot, and what do? But that's the first example. The second one is the water becomes too heavy that it can't be heated up into the sky to form rain. And we know how rain is the major source as well of fresh water and the effects that come with the lack of fresh water. The third one is the cause in rise. This can be talked about in island countries. The rise in sea levels and how it affects their fields and their ways of life going forward. So I hope you understood everything that I've talked about. We will be talking more about water in episode 3 and its security and how it can be secured now that we found out 2 or more major problems that come with salty water as well as fresh water issues and climate change. I hope to see you then for sure. This is a great topic to discuss and still mind-opening for me even as this research is still ongoing. So thank you for taking this flight with me, and I hope to see you on the next flight and the next flight till the end of this research. All this for Earth.